Hi, Bob.
Hi, Bob. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Well, it's a beautiful day in Berkeley. Sun's just coming up. Although, whenever I say that to anybody on the East Coast, they accuse me of being very disrespectful. So I'm not going to even get into it, and I'm certainly not going to gloat.
Yeah. Well, actually, it's a nice day here, so I'm not as offended as I ordinarily would be. But I appreciate you taking the time. We're very happy you're going to do Blogging Heads with us. And you know,
well, I'm delighted. It's a great idea. You know, I have my own blog, and I tried a few little blogging heads of my own, and I think literally it may have been 6 or 7 people watched. It was
you mean
very
vlogs?
exciting.
You mean mono vlogs?
I have a monovlog. I mean mono vlog. Monovlog.
Well, here we're capturing the magic of interpersonal chemistry, and we're hoping it adds a dimension. Not that I'm sure your monologues aren't up there with David Letterman's, but
no, they're monologues mostly in my head. And with the 6 or 7 people who watch. But anyway, I'm glad to be here today.
Yeah, well, I noticed you do have a blog, and I want to congratulate you on your continued career advancement. You've moved from an old economy, pre-internet job, Secretary of Labor in the Clinton administration, to a new economy, internet job, blogger, and you came up with the name, I don't know how many people were in on this consultation, but you came up with the name Robert Reich's blog.
Yeah, there was a lot of market testing and focus groups, and, it became Robert Reich, and then the apostrophe S, Robert Reich's, and then blog. Well, it sort of gets to it, and I don't earn very much money from it.
No, really? You're not one of the affluent bloggers?
I'm an impecunious blogger.
Well, you're also teaching at Berkeley. They pay for that, right?
They do. They do. Thank goodness they pay for that.
Because that's an old economy job, so they pay for that.
It is. It's an old economy lecture, too.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Well, I want to talk basically about 2 kinds of things today, the presidential campaign and the economic meltdown. I wanted to start with the economic meltdown, which, as you know, is ongoing. Now, there's this Bear Stearns bailout. There's some recent news on that, actually, which is that apparently the Bear Stearns stockholders have renegotiated this bailout deal where they're going to get $10 a share rather than $2 a share. Let me tell you why I'm a little disappointed by that. I know from reading your blog you're very skeptical of the whole Wall Street bailout business generally. But leaving that aside for a second, I was kind of happy about this bailout because it seems to me they had kind of managed to kind of reconcile the dilemma or whatever of on the one hand, the moral hazard problem. On the one hand, you want to deliver enough negative feedback to people who made bad decisions to discourage the bad decision making. On the other hand, you don't want to, in the process, take down institutions that lead to the taking down of the whole global economy.
And I share your concern because as the stocks of Bear Stearns are bid upward, the taxpayers of the United States are essentially behind rewarding not only Bear Stearns but also to whatever extent J.P. Morgan is going to be rewarded. I mean, J.P. Morgan may have to now pay more, but even before Bear Stearns stocks were bid upward, J.P. Morgan shareholders were likely to get whatever upside gains came out of the deal. It tends to be, historically, the pattern in the United States. We bail out large entities, financial institutions, and corporations, and we as taxpayers don't get any of the upside gains. We just provide kind of the downside cushion. It's all, in this case, the financiers and the shareholders who are going to get the upside gains, and there will eventually be upside gains, Bob. I mean, unless there is a long depression-like meltdown, eventually these shares are going to be worth something. I mean, the economy rises, the economy eventually does better, the economy eventually turns around, and one hopes that things do better. Why shouldn't the United States taxpayers, who are footing the bill through guarantees? Now, people need to understand that every time the Federal Reserve Board or the Treasury Department or Fannie Mae or any other entity provides a loan guarantee, that ultimately is backed by taxpayers. You and I are saying, in effect, we are going to put up our money if things get much worse. So we're setting a kind of a safety net. And in the short term, they could get worse. In fact, in the short term, whose bet? I mean, I think that Wall Street probably has another $600 billion to write off. In the long term, we know the tendency is to go upward. Why shouldn't we have an equity stake? Why shouldn't the United States government, along with the bailout, take an equity stake, as the British government did, with regard to its big financial house that went
You mean take an equity stake in an investment house like or J.P. Morgan or something, get a piece of J.P. Morgan?
Absolutely. In exchange for the value that the United States taxpayers are putting up, we should have an equity stake in the upside in J.P. Morgan and or in Bear Stearns. It's just like the Dodd-Frank bill. It's now being cooked up in the House and in the Senate, which would, on its face, provide a bailout to people who are going to take on some of the securities that have bad loans wrapped up in them. Nobody wants to buy them because nobody knows how bad the bad loans are. Nobody knows what these things are really worth. So the idea that's emerging from the House and from the Senate, from the Democrats, is to have a kind of auction. And the government organizes an auction and says, okay, you, a big investor or a big investment house, you'll pay 60 cents on the dollar for these securities that nobody's going to buy any other way. But if you turn around and then restructure them so that they can be repaid more easily to the extent that there are bad loans wrapped up in them, we, the United States taxpayers, will give you a guarantee against losses. we'll set a downside guarantee, maybe 80, 90 cents, maybe 100% on the dollar. So you get any upside gains, we take any downside losses. Now that's crazy. I mean, why shouldn't the United States taxpayers have some equity interest here? I mean, why shouldn't we be getting some of the upside gains?
Yeah, well, one probably non-fatal objection that some people would make is, do you really want in the long run the U.S. government in the business of owning equity in these things? Do you want that kind of conflict of interest, or do you want another form of remuneration? Something that would, when the payout came, it would be suddenly liquid.
That's the point. When the payout came, the government would liquidate it, and the Treasury would be paid back, and taxpayers would not do any worse. I mean, in a way, this is what we did with the savings and loan bailout. The federal government took all of these pieces of paper that were worth very, very little, and then resold the equity, resold the collateral that lay behind it, all the pieces of property that had lost their value. That was another kind of bubble. It was another example of a financial bailout. But at least the taxpayers had that collateral, had those pieces of property. They were resold, and the taxpayers actually got a lot back. But here, we're talking about bailouts without, that are taxpayer financed. These guarantees are taxpayer financed. People are not getting this fundamental understanding. You and I and everybody else could very easily be shelling out a hell of a lot of money here, and yet we have none of the upside gains at all.
Yeah, this sounds okay to me. I mean, I think we should put you in somebody's cabinet, but maybe I'm getting ahead of the discussion. We haven't gotten to politics yet. But neither this idea has not been embraced by either candidate, so far as we know.
This has not been embraced by anybody. I mean, I'm whistling in the wind. I talk to everybody, and I talk to Democrats in the Senate and in the House. And the word I get back is, that sounds like socialism. It sounds like government ownership. And what I say back is, look, it's not like what the British government did to that BlackRock bank that was going down, and the Brits now own it, but the Brits will sell it off when its price goes up. No, I'm not talking about outright control. I'm just talking about a piece of the action, so taxpayers get paid back. Anyway, I'm not getting anywhere, but through the magic of your blog, this is going to be a huge issue, and my idea is going to catch on.
I don't think you have to worry. I think I'll take care of the rest. This is as good as policy.
Okay.
Related to this is the question of how bad you think things could get. Because when I read in your blog that you seemed very skeptical about the idea of a Wall Street bailout generically, although I now understand that you could accept one under certain terms. My first thought was, well, there are times when there is such thing as the snowflake that causes the avalanche. Yep. There is such thing as the one investment bank going under that if it goes under, it does create a panic. And the rest is history, and we've seen, what happened with the first depression. And, people always say, or they're not saying this so much anymore, but a couple of years ago, I'd say, wait a second, why couldn't we have a Great Depression? And they say, well, we learned so much about what we did wrong. And I'd say, yeah, but the context has totally changed. We have no experience with a situation like the modern interconnected economy with the internet and everything else. So I don't understand why we shouldn't think the apocalypse can happen. And maybe you can reassure me or share my concerns.
I think I would put the danger of a full-fledged depression. And by the way, there is no official economic definition of a depression. I mean, we know what a recession is, which is 2 quarters of negative growth. I suppose a recession is what? 8 quarters of severely negative growth. I don't know what
a depression you mean?
A full-fledged depression. But I would put the chances of some really serious full-fledged depression at about 20%, which is still too high to be comfortable. Why is that? Because even with all of the knowledge we have in terms of what the Federal Reserve can do to create liquidity, and Ben Bernanke has been very clever at the last few weeks, and what we now know about fiscal policy. John Maynard Keynes was not well known to Franklin D. Roosevelt in the 1930s. In fact, they met once. They didn't hit it off. Roosevelt didn't understand a word that Keynes was saying. Thought he was a little flaky. And the notion of using tax and spending policies to ultimately get us out of a real dip was unknown in the 30s. We certainly could, and we're trying it a little bit. There's certain, Bush's little fiscal stimulus is a joke. But put that to one side. We theoretically could do it. Here's what I'm worried about. In an interconnected global economy, Bob, the thing we haven't experienced is the substantial drop in the value of the dollar, or perhaps even a run on the dollar. As global investors, including American investors who are holding dollars, and most of us, if we have a dollar bill in our wallets, are holding dollars, theoretically at least, dump dollars. I mean, we say, look, we can't trust the dollar to keep its value. It's so encumbered with debt. It's America's international IOU. We are therefore going to start putting our money into euros and into yen and into a variety of other currencies because we want to just be safe. Well, a lot of investors are doing that already, and the problem is that could easily generate an even lower dollar. In fact, obviously, it will generate a lower dollar. And then what happens when the big holders of dollars, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Middle East oil producers say, well, we're also going to diversify. They'll say, well, we're only diversifying out of dollars. We're going to diversify out of dollars. And the dollar could really drop dramatically, which would mean that everything we bought from abroad cost more, including oil, especially oil. That would reduce our standard of living as Americans quite dramatically and quite suddenly. It would generate huge inflation here in the United States. It is true that our exports would pick up, but could not possibly pick up. We couldn't adjust as rapidly as we need to adjust to be a major exporter that was relying on exports instead of our own consumers to keep our economy going. That kind of very sudden jolt is not impossible. In fact, we might look upon, years from now, we might look back upon the spring and say, well, that's when it all happened. So that's a big interconnected issue. The Internet makes it even faster as a possibility. Or to put the matter in a little different way, we don't need to worry just about runs on Bear Stearns. It's runs on America.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've always, the dollar thing has always kind of confused me because people act, it seemed to me that the pros and cons, that a strong and weak dollar, have pros and cons. And clearly, some weakening of the dollar has benefits, right? In terms of growing demand for American.
Well, the big benefit of a weaker dollar, honestly, is that we can sell more to the rest of the world. We don't have to worry about American consumers doing all the buying, and that means perhaps more manufacturing jobs. But that can so easily be overwhelmed by the fact that we are so much of an importer. We depend so much on imports.
Well, that's
for
the
our
downside.
It's
inflationary.
And it could be hugely inflationary, but, oil prices are already out of control for many people. We could see oil prices going up to not just $108 a barrel. We could see $200 a barrel oil. Think what that would do to the United States overall.
Yeah, and so, I guess, I don't know, on the U.S., the U.S. sits here and says, our official policy is we're for a strong dollar, and they hope that the world will believe them, which increase, I don't know whether it does anymore, but in any event, it seemed to me that, well, we actually surely would, our official policy is to welcome some weakening with respect to the Chinese currency, and some of the same logic applies with respect to other countries, and it seems to me that the thing to focus on is what I think you're focusing on, is not so much whether it drops, or even so much the ultimate level of drop as the speed of the drop.
That's right. It's the speed and basically the suddenness of all of the dislocations that go along with it. The American economy simply could not adjust if they were run on the dollar. Now, what would happen, I expect, similarly to a run on Bear Stearns, the Federal Reserve Board, in this instance, working with the European Central Bank and other central banks, would start buying up dollars. They would try to avoid a run. They would make it clear to the international financial community that if you think you're going to make a lot of money by buying up dollars now, in the short term, you're fooling yourself because we're going to prop up the dollar. That is, if you think you're going to get a lot of money by dumping dollars, you're fooling yourselves because we're going to prop up the dollar. That might work for a little time, but again, whether it avoids a run is another story. There are other interconnected issues here. The United States is basically in the pickle we're in because, after all, American consumers, middle-class people, have not had much of a raise since the 1970s. We are deep in debt, most of us. Mainly because we've tried to continue to consume even though our wages have not risen. And yet the American economy is so much larger than it was even 6 or 7 years ago. Why aren't we doing better in terms of median wages? Because most of the gains have gone to the top. And the people at the top don't spend nearly the same percentage of their income as people in the middle or below. People at the top already have most of what they need. And that creates its own imbalance in the economy.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you have a policy whereby some of their money gets to me, I will happily spend it and do my nation a service.
Well, I do. I'm not sure it's going to get to you, but I do think that we've got to take seriously tax reform in terms of enlarging the what's called the earned income tax credit, so that people who are earning, let's say, $14,000 to the median income, $50,000 approximately, those people can get a wage subsidy. And that's financed by a higher marginal tax rate of people on the top. We just can't live with the kind of inequality we are now driving toward, Bob. It's not only bad for the country in terms of our democracy, it's also very bad for the economy.
Yeah, the earned income tax credit is one of the things that has fairly broad support, cross-ideologically among actual policy thinkers, and it has gotten expanded over the years. It has worked its way into actual policy. But I am for whatever further expansion you think is in order. Let me ask you one more quick, actually politically related question about the economy as we transition into a discussion of politics. Do you think I've been advocating that the Democratic candidates, and maybe Obama's better positioned to do this, but in any event, make a connection that I think is probably analytically valid and certainly could be made to work rhetorically, which is connect the Iraq War to the economic problems. I'm wondering, because, the logic is just, look, part of the thing that got us where we are in terms of weaker dollar, in terms of facing enough inflation that the policy levers at our disposal are kind of constrained, is the budget deficit. That's a big part of the problem, an ongoing budget deficit. The Iraq War has contributed hugely to the deficit. The tax cuts for the rich have contributed to the deficit. This just seems to me almost made to order for an opponent of George Bush's, especially one who opposed the Iraq War. Do you think it's in addition to being possibly rhetorically effective, an actual valid connection?
I think it is valid. You've got to be a little careful with it because the budget deficit as a proportion of the whole nation's economy, is actually smaller now than it was in the 1990s. Even though George W. has added something in the order of $4 trillion to the national debt.
So this is deficit as proportion of economy. Although by the end of the 90s, was there a deficit? I mean, you were
by the end of the 90s there was no deficit at all. There was a surplus.
Okay.
But when we were last really in trouble, in other words, when I came into and the Clinton administration began, we had a budget deficit that was about 5% of the national economy, the GDP. Now the budget deficit is around, when I last looked, around 2%. That's not nothing. And you're right that if the costs of the war continue to mount, and Joe Stiglitz is now talking about $4 trillion in total, that's money that we don't have to do a lot else in this country with regard to everything from healthcare to schools to homeland security to anything else you name, and global warming. It also means, you're absolutely right, that the policy levers, fiscal and monetary policy, are that much more constrained. It's just the only hesitation I have is that it's not as dire as it was in the early 1990s after the first George Bush and after Ronald Reagan left us with a huge supply side problem. Now, here I want to just veer off politically a little bit and just say I think one of the big failures of the Democrats by the end of the 90s was to say, now we have some money. Now we have this budget surplus. Now we can actually get on with what Bill Clinton was talking about in 1992 that we had to do, whether it's health insurance or infrastructure or education or alternative energy, non-carbon-based energy. We have the money. We have the wherewithal. Let's begin to do it. And Al Gore could have in the 2001 election, he could have said, now is the time to really get on with this agenda. But the Democrats went out. They become fiscal, warmed-over Calvin Coolidge conservatives, saying that the first thing that has to be done with the surplus is to bring down the national debt. Well, I'm sorry. I mean, if the Democrats are going to be Calvin Coolidge, that lets Republicans off the hook. And that set up George W. Bush to say, well, why not? The first thing we do is to give this money back to the rich in terms of a giant tax cut, which Alan Greenspan, of course, agreed to. Today's Democrats, Bob, are still, too many of them, are into this Calvin Coolidge economics. Bob Rubin is the leader of this team, and I think it's just plain wrong.
Okay. So you're actually not a deficit hawk. So hence your careful qualification of your answer to that question. You do think it's fair to say the Iraq War has contributed to the chances of a complete financial meltdown in some degree.
Yes, and another point that we haven't been talking about connecting the Iraqi War to the financial problems of the country is that America's place in the world, our standing in the world, is so low now. That if it comes to a choice between selling dollars and buying euros and yen and kind of keeping America strong, a lot of people in the rest of the world say, well, we don't care about a strong America. I mean, let's just sell these greenbacks.
So there's this intangible effect, this psychological effect as well that makes the second one.
Absolutely, I'm sure.
Okay. Well, thanks. The carefulness of your qualification there, I think, convinces me that you should continue to stay out of electoral politics, and just if you can't go for the juggler when it's there. But I do hope you wind up in another cabinet.
Well, on this issue of the deficit hawks that still inhabit the Democratic Party, we are now at a point. If the Democrats do take the White House come January of 2009, if we're into this balanced budget craziness as Democrats, there's simply not going to be any possibility to do national affordable health insurance or do half of the things that Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama are talking about.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Speaking of Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, now you have not. Have you formally endorsed either?
No, I haven't.
You have not. Just out of curiosity, what do you think of this Bill Richardson thing? He, of course, like you, as a former Clinton cabinet official, endorsed Obama recently, was compared to Judas by James Carville for that.
Worse things have happened to people in their lifetimes than James Carville comparing them to Judas. Maybe not too many, but, and my heart goes out to Bill Richardson, but he will survive. I
think he will survive. So you think it's possibly an overstated charge?
I think it's overstated in the 100th degree. Look, Bill Richardson, I think, made a judgment, and I respect him for it. I'm in a slightly more awkward position. I'm not I've never been an elected official, for one thing, so who I endorse is a little bit, a presumptuous issue. But also, Bill Richardson is a superdelegate. I think he was a candidate for president. I think people really want to know which way he was going. I think he made a very courageous decision.
Well, I'm impressed by your modesty in saying that your endorsement wouldn't matter nearly as much. But I'll tell you one thing: if you endorsed Obama right now, and the news were that a second Clinton cabinet official, do you want to maximize the impact of any endorsement you might make? I leave the airwaves to you. Go ahead. Here's your chance. This actually. This is your moment. I don't expect you to take advantage of it. But,
well, I'm not going to take advantage of it right now. But let me just say, I have not been pleased at all with the campaign that Hillary Clinton has been waging. I think she's got terrible advice, probably from Mark Penn, who is the pollster and says he's the strategic head of the campaign. I mean, it's been much too much a negative campaign. It's been all over the place. They're now talking, I hear, about making the argument to superdelegates that even though the Clinton campaign doesn't have the popular vote and hasn't won the primary enough of the primaries, still it has a majority of the electoral vote, and therefore superdelegates should go along with the electoral vote. Now, I thought after what happened to Al Gore in 2000, Democrats were in the forefront of saying the electoral vote should never preempt the popular vote. And here we have Hillary Clinton's campaign and surrogates that were saying that that ought to be the case now. It's absurd, and I've criticized on my blog a number of times when I felt that they deserved it, how the Clintons are conducting this campaign. I was very disappointed with my old friend Bill Clinton in terms of, he says he was not using veiled racism before South Carolina. He says that he's not in any way criticizing Barack Obama unfairly. Well, I'm sorry. If you look at what he has said closely, I think that this is just the wrong kind of politics. It's the old politics.
And so, for example, in this more recent case of him imagining a Hillary McCain contest and saying that there you would have, what do you say, two people who love America and you wouldn't have to list it, something like that. And the question was he saying that Barack Obama doesn't love America or something? I don't know. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, I am, and it's another example. I mean, here we have our former president saying, oh, no, I didn't mean in any way to denigrate Barack Obama. But when he says it would be so great if Hillary Clinton, and John McCain were running against each other, because then we would really have two people who love America. What are you supposed to take from that kind of a comment? I mean, it's if it's not a very thinly veiled assertion that Barack Obama does not love America and is not patriotic, I don't know what it stands for. And maybe Bill Clinton is on automatic pilot and doesn't realize what he's saying. But please, this kind of negative campaign, and then Hillary Clinton's statement not too long ago that she and McCain would be great on foreign policy. That's the kind of commander-in-chief we need. Both would be stronger than Barack Obama. I don't remember in a primary contest, particularly Democratic primary, one opponent saying that the Republican, the would-be Republican, in fact, the inevitable, in this case, Republican candidate, would be better than his or her Democratic opponent. Where have we gone? Why are they willing to basically reduce the chances of a Democrat getting to the White House?
I don't know. I'm curious. Have you had any contact with the Obama campaign, or
Well, they've asked me for my advice on a number of matters, and I certainly have given them as much and as good advice as I can about economic issues. And the Edwards campaign also asked me my advice on a number of issues, and I'm here and willing and happy to help.
Well, it sounds to me like, it's pretty clear where you're leaning, and far be it from me to give you advice about when to make your big pronouncements. But again, if you want to go ahead and endorse Obama right now, all the people associated with Blogging Heads TV would not be averse to happening to be the forum over which you did it. But I understand you'd probably rather have, Obama standing next to you than me.
I'll tell you, just between us, not to go on this
I won't tell anybody.
I also, I've known the Clintons for 40 years, and I just, every time I even think about going in one way that may be opposite to them, it just doesn't feel right. And maybe at some point I'll overcome that. But that kind of long-term association makes me reluctant to say anything about beyond the specific criticisms that I just feel very deeply.
Yeah, it's true. Now, you met Clinton going over on the boat you were both Rhodes Scholars, is that right? I mean, unless I'm mixed up, isn't there this story about one of you being sick and the other one bringing that one soup on the boat?
Yeah, it was me. I was sick, and I thought I'd die. I don't know if you've ever been seasick, but if you're seasick, I don't even know why in 1968 we were on a ship going to Oxford, because there were planes in those days. But the tradition was that the Rhodes group went off, in a ship to get to know each other, and I wasn't getting to know anybody because I was downstairs sick, and he came to my door with chicken soup and crackers. And in those days, he didn't say, "I feel your pain." That came later. But he was very kind and obviously empathic, and we began a conversation that continued for many years.
Uh-huh. But you haven't talked to them so recently?
No, I think the last time I saw them was before the campaign.
Mm-hmm. In terms of the effect of all this on the party, we talked about apocalyptic scenarios with the economy. Let's talk about them with the party. I think the conventional thinking is that if Obama winds up with a majority of pledged delegates, and the superdelegates, even if at the end he is suffering some massive momentum loss, okay, let's assume he even loses North Carolina and Oregon, and gets killed in Pennsylvania. I think the thinking of a lot of people is that even so, if he still has a lead in pledged delegates, and the superdelegates decide in effect not to give it to him and to give it to Hillary, the thinking of a lot of people is that will not just tear the Democratic Party apart, but permanently alter its structure in the sense of alienating a good part of the black part of its base. Do you agree with that?
I do agree with that. And not only alienating the blacks, but alienating millions and millions and millions of young people who have come into the election, who have been kind of excited by politics. One of the strongest arguments for the Obama candidacy in terms of my values is the engagement that he is generating among young people who haven't been this involved in politics since my day, when I got involved in politics, late 60s, because of people like Robert Kennedy. And if the Democrat Party were to really turn its back on the primaries and the popular vote and make what looked like a backroom deal, I do believe that the party would be split asunder. Like it was, for slightly different reasons, in 1968. It would just look to all the world as if the Democrats were, a machine, the old political machine. It was the old politics, rather than something very, very new looking forward.
And you think it would also doom its chances of winning the general election?
I think it would make it much, much, much harder for Democrats to win the general election. And I also think it would cast a pall over a lot of the congressional elections as well. Politics is about enthusiasm, about mobilization, about energy. It's not just about who can raise enough money to put ads on the television. If we've seen anything in this primary campaign season that seems to be dragging on forever, we've seen the enormous influence and power and importance of the people on the ground. Good organization, but also a commitment of people. I mean, the stories coming out of the caucus states of people driving through snowstorms and huge numbers of people showing up, numbers that these caucus states have not seen ever before appearing because average citizens just thought that it was so important and they were so fired up. Well, that's the stuff of politics. It should be, Bob. It hasn't been for years. A lot of Americans have become so cynical that politics, they think, is run by the big guys, run by the special interests, run by the biggest campaign contributors. But the essence of American politics, the essence of our democracy, is people's mobilization and energy and people caring about the country and staying mobilized and energized. I remember, I don't know if you recall that anecdote about Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1936. He was running for re-election. The country was still in miserable shape. And some lady came up and said, Mr. President, I'd like to vote for you again, but you must promise to do this and this and this and this. And then he turned to her, and there were thousands around him, and he said, ma'am, I want to do everything on your list, but if I'm re-elected, I can't promise to do them. You must make me. Now, what did he mean by that? He meant that the only way anything good can happen in Washington is if people are out there, average Americans are mobilized and energized to make it happen. I've been, spent almost half of my adult life in Washington. And I can tell you that Washington is very sensitive when the public is mobilized. But when the public isn't mobilized around something, it's back to business as usual. It's the worst of the old politics.
Yeah, of course, the other side of the question. I mean, in terms of the Democratic Party's fate is okay. What if Obama does win? What are the chances? Everyone agrees he sustained some damage last week. His speech repaired certainly some of the damage with at least some people, with at least some of the constituency. It certainly didn't help him in all corners. What do you think how strong can he wind up being going into the general?
Well, we don't know. I mean, neither of these people, Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama, has been in a general election as the standard bearer for the Democrats. We know that both of them have taken a lot of heat. I mean, Barack Obama with regard to his pastor, Hillary Clinton with regard to a lot of things in the 1990s. Now, she says, with some justification, that she knows how to take the heat because she has taken it. But she wasn't president in the 1990s. She was First Lady. She took a lot of heat in terms of bad publicity over a whole variety of things. But that's different than being a presidential candidate and actually being kind of the person who's being targeted by the other side. It's not going to be a pretty election. I imagine that the Republicans and John McCain, whoever is the Democratic nominee, are really going to pull out all the stops. I've heard, and again, what I hear is probably the same thing that other people hear, and maybe it's the rumor mill, and who knows what the rumor mill, how accurate the rumor mill is. But Rush Limbaugh and many of the conservative right who are in the chattering classes, pundit classes, they have been pushing Hillary to be the nominee, actually urging voters in primary states to vote for Hillary Clinton because they want her to be the one that they can skewer when the general election occurs because they know how easy she will be to skewer. Her negatives have remained very high, and they are a little bit anxious about how they will do skewering Barack Obama. Now, again, I think that there is some basis to that rumor, but whether the conservatives are correct that Hillary Clinton will be easier to skewer than Barack Obama, I don't know. Whoever is going to be the Democratic nominee, in other words, bottom line, is going to have to be prepared for just a huge amount of negative and perhaps even very unfair and dirty tricks, as well as everything else.
Yeah, well, I think Limbaugh very explicitly urged Texas voters to vote for her, and some people think that may have made a difference. I think it's not totally clear what his rationale was. I think some people say, and maybe this is what he said, that he just wanted to keep the bloodshed going. At that point, a Hillary victory in Texas was the only way to keep bloodshed going on the Democratic side. And in fact, I do think that there has been something of a shift among conservatives. I think it's not so clear in their eyes as it used to be who would be a more beatable candidate. They think that this pastor thing has made Obama a much less marketable candidate in the general, and they think that for purposes of the general election, his speech has not solved the problem.
Well, I'm sure that if whoever is going to be the Democratic nominee is going to replay over and over again things like John McCain's gaffe last week with regard to the Iranians and the Al Qaeda that he repeated over and over and over again until Joe Lieberman whispered to him that it was simply inaccurate. There are so many things in John McCain's life that if Democrats want to play hardball, they can play hardball with. And his flip-flop on the Bush tax cut, his flip-flop on Jerry Falwell, his support. Talk about pastors. John McCain, kissing up to Jerry Falwell recently with regard to what Jerry Falwell has said and what he represents in this country. How can you compare that to even the worst of what people think about Barack Obama and his pastor? Look, I cringe, to use that unfortunate word, when I think about the general election coming up. Bob, it's going to be rough. It's going to be a lot of blood on the streets, not literally, but metaphorically, because so much is at stake, and the Republicans don't want to give up the White House. But I am pretty optimistic, not only with regard to the White House, but also Congress. I think there's a very good chance that we'll get 60 votes, 60 seats in the Senate for the first time in my memory, at least with regard to having a president and also a working majority in the House. This could be a Democratic sweep. Largely because of the economy and also the Iraqi war. The stars are lining up very favorably here.
Yeah, they don't feel as favorable to me as they felt a few weeks ago, but
well, that's because you're in Washington. You are in Washington?
I'm not in Washington.
I am so apologetic.
I'm in scenic New Jersey.
Oh, well, then you are absolved from the Washington echo chamber.
I am not part of the problem, Bob. I'm part of the solution.
You are indeed. You're still on the East Coast, Boston, Washington, New York corridor, so you're not completely absolved. Us here in the pure, pristine West Coast, we can take a long and kind of dispassionate view of what's happening.
Okay, well, I will. I'll let you get back to your pondering of the situation. This has been great. I really appreciate you taking the time. Hope you'll be up for doing it again.
Well, I certainly would, and thanks so much for asking me. Now, if I can figure out how to get this to you, we'll be in better shape. But I gather that I'm supposed to sign off.
The first thing we'll do is sign off, and then the rest will be made clear to you by our able and efficient staff. But stay on the line, and
okay.
just click the button. Okay. Thanks a lot, Bob.
You take care.
Bye-bye.